So, researchers have debated the nature of intelligence for a very long time. It sort of started out, in fact, you can sort of conceptualize it in the ways that we think about it on the next two slides. Charles Spearman was one of the first researchers in intelligence, and he suggested that intelligence is sort of one generalized characteristic. If you're smart in all kinds of ways, verbally, sort of mathematically, mechanically, all of those kinds of ways. He, in fact, came up with this notion of generalized intelligence, which he called G. Thurstone later proposed that intelligence is actually all kinds of things, and you could be stronger in one than in others, though they were usually correlated, but not perfectly so. So that intelligence had various components to it. There was reasoning, there was associative memory, there was the ability to look at things spatially, and the ability to handle things numerically, verbally, and so forth. And that was sort of Thurstone's approach to this, is it actually had multiple components. Raymond Cattell had a similar kind of approach, but his thinking was that generalized intelligence, this thing we called G as a result of Spearman originally, had two forms. One was called crystallized intelligence, and the other was called fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence was sort of information that you already knew and had already stored and so forth, and fluid intelligence was that intelligence that enables you to learn new things quickly, and sort of thought about those in two different forms. Howard Gardner, who is a contemporary, so he's still working on these things, suggested the notion of multiple intelligences, so that we could have various kind of intelligences, and these are the list of them. They're linguistic, spatial, you could have mathematical, musical, body or kinesthetic kinds of intelligence, and you can imagine where this is the case, where you can look at a lot of sporting performance, for example, the ability to do amazing things on the field or on the court as a type of intelligence. We usually don't think about it that way, but let's face it, it's not easy to do, and if everybody could do it, we'd probably all be doing it. So bodily and kinesthetic intelligence is important. There's interpersonal intelligence, our ability to interact with each other, and intrapersonal intelligence, even that sort of how we understand ourselves, etc. Another contemporary, that is a person that's still around these days, is a fellow named Robert Sternberg, and he suggested that intelligence comprises cognitive abilities, including analytical, practical, and creative intelligence. And then finally, Dan Goleman, who's still around these days and doing good work, suggested the notion of emotional intelligence. And what he means by that is, sure, there's intelligence as we typically think about it, but there's another type of intelligence that coexists with that. And that really involves our ability to handle emotional content, including interpersonal and intrapersonal kinds of knowledge. So as you can see, the jury on what exactly intelligence is still out. And there's a lot of different ways that one can think about it, and it's sort of been refined over time. And over time, it's actually broadened as opposed to, converged. Imaging studies suggest that measures of intelligence positively correlate with brain volume, so sort of the bigger your brain, a bit more intelligence you have, especially the thickness of the cerebral cortex, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and the temporal lobes. So intelligent brains tend to be pretty quick and efficient communicators of information from one area to another, which of course is why you would require all of that neural tissue. In men, IQ tends to be correlated with the amount of gray matter located in both the frontal lobes and, interestingly, the left parietal lobe. In women, it's different, though. IQ tends to highly correlate with volume of gray matter in the right frontal lobe and Broca's area, as well as with volume of white matter throughout the brain. So men and women tend to be equally intelligent, but they seem to get to that intelligence in slightly different ways, at least biologically. So general intelligence was more likely linked to gray matter in men, but white matter in women. So structural differences help explain why these males and females differ in brain size and structure, but don't differ in measures of general intelligence. They seem to follow different paths to that intelligent behavior, which is pretty darn interesting. Brains of people with high scores on standardized intelligence tests don't have to work as hard, frankly, as the brains of people with lower scores to solve the same problems. So in some ways, you can really think about intelligence as this ability to process information quickly and especially efficiently. You don't have to put in as much effort in order to reach the same goal if you have a fair amount of intelligence. And it seems to be related to the timing of brain development, at least somewhat. So as children approach puberty, gray matter of the brain experiences a really rapid period of growth, and that slows down again later in adolescence. So children with average IQ scores tend to show a peak thickening of the cortical gray matter around the age of 8. But children with really superior IQ scores experienced a later peak thickening at around age 13. So it doesn't make sense to really think about intelligence as either nature or nurture, but of course it ends up being both, like so many things, right? So this either-or thinking about this is rarely correct when we're considering human behavior, especially intelligence. So heredity does interact with experience and other factors to produce results. So if, for example, infants who are breastfed tend to have higher IQs, but that's only with children with one variation of a particular gene. So it doesn't work particularly well for all children, but only for children with a particular variation of a gene. So the heritability of adult IQ scores is around 0.75. That means 75% of the variance in intelligence in the population can be attributed to genetics. But it doesn't mean that 75% of an individual's intelligence is due to his or her genes. So it's really applied to the population, not to an individual. Overall brain size and proportion of gray matter correlate with intelligence, and those are about 85% heritable. Although many genes influence brain development, none, not one, conclusively is linked to higher IQ performance. It's probably likely that many genes, each with a small impact, sort of interact with the individual's environment to produce intelligence. One interesting thing, and actually an encouraging thing, is called the Flynn effect. And that is there's an increase in average IQ in recent decades. So this suggests that inherited characteristics aren't really fixed. It certainly occurred too quickly to be genetic changes, and it's more likely to have resulted from some type of environmental change, like improvements in health, nutrition, things like that. So the World Health Organization showed that there's strong correlations between a nation's freedom, interestingly, from serious infections and infectious diseases and its citizens' average IQ. So the less serious infections you have, the higher IQ you tend to have in a population. As nations become wealthier and more capable of eradicating disease, their citizens tend to have higher IQs. So not surprisingly, a favorable environment improves the child's IQ. Nutrition, medical care, all of those kinds of things. Interestingly, the parent's income tends to affect the environment, which can increase or decrease IQ. Including other kinds of components like motivational differences. Parents in upper and middle income families are able to provide financial and psychological support that children might not be able to have in lower income families. So living in an impoverished environment can actually impair development of cognitive skills. So here are a couple of the environmental influences that can magnify effects of genetic influence. So lower socioeconomic status, less exposure to books, fewer teachers or not as good at teachers, less supplies, malnutrition, all of those kinds of things can tend to reduce a child's intelligence quotient.